So my name is indeed Ruud Hortensius. I'm a postdoc working here at the Institute of Neuroscience and Psychology at the University of Glasgow. And in my research, I look at human social cognition. So how we perceive each other's emotions, how we react to other people's emotions, but also what the role of the frontal cortex is in aggression and motivation. And also looking at group behavior and empathy. And I'm using fMRI and behavioral measures to understand how people actually make sense of a social world. However, in the last 2 years, I've been looking at how people make sense of a social world filled with technology. So how do we perceive the emotions of robots? How do we react to these emotions? And also, how do we form relationships with robots over a longer time? And so this is what I term contemporary social cognition, really trying to understand how people make sense of a world filled with technology. And we have all these new artificial agents in our environment. So we have a robotic vacuuming cleaner, so a Roomba. We have a humanoid-looking robot Pepper, but also we have Alexa in our home. And sometimes we see these robots or these artificial agents as simple machines, but sometimes we attribute all these human-like characteristics to these inanimate objects. And so I'm really interested how we attribute this socialness to these artificial agents. And the attribution of socialness is taking place every day. So we do it throughout the day. So every moment we make split-second decisions on if our colleague is happy, can be trusted, we recognize our friend across the street, and this is really the attribution of socialness, which Fritz Heider, who's one of the founding fathers of social cognition, termed as extracting invariance, so perceptions, intentions, emotions, out of variance. That is the stream of agents' behavior. And there are multiple ways to do this. So Daniel Dennett, one of a very famous philosopher, argued that we use 3 different stances to predict the present and future behavior of other agents. So if we use the physical stance, for example, by explaining the behavior of a ball, we use laws of physics or chemistry, for example. Whereas if we try to explain the behavior of a robotic arm, we might be informed by the design features of this robotic arm. So we know the degrees of freedom, so we use that to explain future states of this agent. So the question really is, what's happening if we interact with humanoid-looking robots or any robot in particular? Do we use an intentional stance, what we use to interact with other humans? So an intentional stance, basically we assume that the other agent is a rational being, and so we infer that future states will be as a consequence of the intentions of this agent. So the question really is, how do we attribute socialness to artificial agents? And do we ultimately attribute intention to these agents? So I will argue that because the goal is to socialize with social robots, right? So it's per definition a social situation. We should take a neurocognitive perspective by really trying to delineate the mechanisms that allow us to perceive and react to these agents. So by taking a neurocognitive perspective, we can dissect all the critical aspects of social cognition. And as I'm a social neuroscientist, I'm interested in the brain and behavior. So we can look at the person perception network, a key network that allows us to recognize other individuals, not only who this individual is, but also the emotion of this individual. But also we can look at the theory of mind network that allows us to infer the mental states of other humans. And then we also can look at empathy for pain, so the feeling of sympathy for other people. So the question really what I'm trying to answer is if similar neural mechanisms are co-opted during interactions with these social robots. So is there some kind of shared representation of social cognition? And if we go back into the literature, we see that these different networks have different like selective criteria. So for example, the person perception network is not really concerned with the artificial nature of the agent, so is as active for an emotional phase expressed by a robot as for a human. However, the theory of mind network is much more selective, so it's really only engaged when we interact or perceive a fellow human. So this already informs our future studies if similar neural mechanisms are underlying interactions with robots. And there are multiple ways to dissect this human-robot interaction. So we have a human, we have a robot, and we have the interaction. So previously, people assumed that stimulus cues, such as form and movement, are really influential in making, like, predicting how people would perceive this robotic agent. However, over the course of the last years, knowledge cues are much more important. So studies have shown that if people believe, for example, the work by Emily Cross showed that if people believe that the movement is originated from a human, but the form of the movement, or like the stimulus, is still robotic, these brain networks underlying social cognition are engaged. So it's really not the form, but it's the belief that the human holds. So it's more like the cognitive reconstruction that takes place in the human actor, and not so much as the form of the robot. So we have the human, we have the robot, and then I would argue that knowledge cues are, like, of course they interact with the form of the robot, but on many occasions knowledge cues such as beliefs and expectations, also informed by popular media, are much more important than just a simple form, because we see a face in everything, so it's really easy to trick the mind into believing that this is an intentional agent. However, I'm much more interested in the interaction. So what happens if we have these real interactions between a human and a robot? So we need to study human-robot interaction in reality, not looking at the perception of robots, but really like trying to interact with a robot. So me trying to interact with them now, and then see how that shapes the representation of social cognition. Right, so in the next couple of minutes, I want to give you an overview of the latest work I've been doing. So my overall aim is to understand the flexibility and adaptability of social cognition during interactions with social robots. And so the first study I want to discuss is the flexibility of empathy. Then follow-up study on this is the attribution of intentions and emotions. And then we have a side project looking at anthropomorphism and the relation between anthropomorphism and theory of mind. And then I want to end on the future outlook. So how can we improve our understanding of human-robot interaction? And if you have any questions throughout the talk, just shout. Otherwise I will continue talking, and then the 45 minutes will be over. So if you have any clarifications, questions, just let me know. Right, so as I already said, we need to move away from like passive observations of static images on the screen and really try to get to long-term interactions with social robots. And there's also there's already some studies doing that. For example, Claire Press looked at automatic imitation. Tanaka looked at long-term socializing with a robot over like 3 months or so. And so our study that we published recently has been looking somewhere in between, like a long-term social interaction and a one-day interaction. So it's a 5-day interaction. So we're really trying to get past the 10-hour rule, which is a critical rule in social robotics, in that if you don't So after 10 hours, people are bored with robots. So people, like developers, always try to like make sure that you get past the 10-hour rule. So we try to get past the 10-hour rule in our studies as well. Sometimes it works, sometimes it doesn't. It depends on the participant, as we will see in a moment. Right, so in the first study, I want to test the flexibility of empathy. So empathy is this very interesting phenomena that we sometimes even can feel for robots. So this is Boston Dynamics showcasing the balance of their robots, and in order to do that, they either push or kick the robot. So it's not really like trying to punish the robot, but people have these very strong reactions to it. So if you go on Twitter, people say, like, robots are so cool, I actually felt sorry for this one when it was kicked. It looked so dog-like. And then even at one point, an organization, PATA, involved in like animal welfare, had to release a statement that this is really not like okay to kick a living dog. So they're not really bothered by a robot dog, but still they think it's bad. So there's already some anecdotal evidence that people feel these feelings of empathy for a robot. Some more evidence comes from the US Army. So we have these bomb defusing robots. And so this article asked the question, if soldiers are getting too emotionally attached to war soldiers, what good are these robots anyway, right? Because Julie Carpenter interviewed these military personnel, and they felt a range of emotions when the robot was destroyed, held funerals, they attributed human or animal-like attributes to these robots. They even held funerals and felt empathy. So this really gives you a sense that even soldiers that shouldn't feel empathy towards robots because they are a tool in order to help them do their job, feel empathy, then maybe we can have feelings of empathy for these robots. So looking at the brain, we have the pain matrix. And the pain matrix is a network of brain regions that is involved when you feel pain yourself or when you observe the pain of somebody else. So if I stick a needle in my hand, I will feel pain, and it will correspond to brain activity in the pain matrix, but you will have activity in the same network as well, associated with feelings of sympathy and distress for somebody else. So there's already a previous study by Astrid Rosenthal van der Putten who found that compared to a human, a robotic dinosaur that was being strangled or kicked elicited less self-reported empathy, also observed in physiology and also observed in particular parts of the brain. Well, this is not conclusive evidence. It suggests that there's like a difference still between humans in pain and observing robots in pain. But the question really is, like, what is the impact of a long-term socializing intervention on these feelings of empathy? So what we did is we had this repetition suppression design, which I will explain in a moment, to test if after 5 days of interacting, there will be more human-like responses to observing a robot in pain than before the 5-day interactions. So repetition suppression works in a way that if you show a stimulus twice, then activity in the brain region responsive to the stimulus will decrease, so repetition suppression. So the question is, what happens if you show a human? Sorry, yeah?
Sorry, maybe just to clarify, do you draw a difference between social or emotional empathy? Or?
So in this study, no, but that's a really good point. So I will come to that in the concluding slide, as you will see in a moment. What happens if you show a human in pain followed by a robot in pain? Does that lead to suppression of activity in the pain matrix? Because you would expect that a human followed by a human would reduce activity in this brain network. But the question really is, what happens if a robot is followed by a human or vice versa? Does that decrease activity? And our hypothesis was that only after the 5-day interaction there would be more overlap, meaning that when you observe a robot in pain followed by a human in pain, this would reduce activity in the pain matrix. And you can check out the period station dataset and Neurovolt. These links are active, so if you have the slides, you can explore the data a little bit more. So basically, what we did is we had this actor come into the lab, and then we asked her to react to a painful stimulus, so like receiving electrical stimulation that could either result in a painful reaction or a pleasure reaction. We did the same with Cosmo, which is a robot, which I will explain in a moment. So we showed videos of a human in pain. So this is an actor, which I'm about to show you. So this is not real. So you can see the light turning on, and then that would induce like the electric shock. And then we have Cosmo. So we have like a different versions of these videos as well. And so the question really is, if you show like Cosmo in pain followed by human in pain, does that decrease activity in the pain matrix? So we had a human in pain, a human experienced pleasure, and the same for Cosmo.
Could you actually tell that it's fake pain? Could they tell that there's a difference between real pain and fake pain?
So we didn't. So what we asked participants to do in the pilots to rate from like extremely painful to extremely pleasurable.
On her face, like you can tell that it's fake.
You can tell. You can tell. Or
Did you control for this?
so.
Pain versus fake pain?
Yeah, so like we couldn't record like actual pain through. But so we did some pilot experiments for like rating, and then we had like different. So we had a parametric increase in pain. So we have this nice curve for like the human in pain, but also for the robot in pain. So while it's like, of course, it's fake. It's like an actor. It's like parametrically modulated. So we picked like the extreme pain. And some mild pain, and then some mild pleasure and extreme pleasure.
In a way, is it one of you know how pain should look like?
Yeah.
So you're estimating how well the actor is kind of
Yes.
communicating.
Yes. That's true. So of course, we couldn't. So like at one point when discussing like setting up this experiment, like could we actually have like these real electric shocks, right? But then giving time constraints, like getting ethics approval, which of course eventually you will get ethics approval, but it's like a much longer process. So this of course is a proxy for real pain. But I have to say I was like really convinced by the acting skills of the actor. So yeah, the critical point is that we showed this like parametric increase. Right, so then our setup is as follows. So we have a pre-socializing fMRI session. So they did the task. And then at the end of the session, they were handed a Cosmo robot, which is developed by Anki, or was developed by Anki, because it no longer is alive. So the company ceased to exist. But so Cosmo is a small palm-sized robot that has internally and externally triggered behaviors. It has an emotion engine, so it keeps track of every time you say no to the robot, it will like get a little bit more frustrated. So it's really the behavior is dependent on you, but also on the internal state. Has face recognition, and it logs everything, which is very useful for us, as we'll show in the final slides. And then, as part of the socializing intervention, people were asked to interact with Cosmo for at least half an hour every day. And then they could either have like free human-robot interaction. So there's no sound, but so Cosmo just recognized Veronica, who was a volunteer in the lab. So there's like this human-robot interaction. There you can play games, so quick tap game, memory games. So it's really unrestricted. And you could observe Cosmo's behavior. So this is what we call hiking. So Cosmo like playing around, reacting to your cat, etc. Right. So these are real interactions. So this is a picture of a participant that you can see like a very jealous cat because like the human is bonding with the robot and not with the cat. Right, so before getting into the brain, so this is actually the data we get from the log file, so we can see when participant interacted with the Cosmo robot, and you can see already like a lot of variation. So there's one participant that interacted more than 400 minutes, whereas some didn't reach like the threshold of like the half an hour every day. So there's a huge variability. So we asked some subjective questions. So after this 5-day interaction, do you feel closer to the robot or not? So you can ask like, you have a circle, yourself and the other, for example, your friend or your partner, and you would see yourself as close, then the circles will overlap. And so this is what we can do with Cosmo as well. So on the left, you have the pre-socializing data, and on the right, you have the post-socializing data. And then as you can see, the self-rated overlap between the participant and their friend is the highest. Between the person in the video is a bit lower, and then Cosmo. There's not a lot of self-rated overlap between the participants and Cosmo, but neither is there for a stranger. But this doesn't increase after the post-socializing intervention, which is funny because like talking to participants, some really enjoyed it interacting with Cosmo. So they would say, yes, like the Cosmo is a pet. I'm very sad to like finish this experiment now, and other people hated it. Or hated it, that's maybe a strong word, but they were like, yeah, it's a bit like, I don't know, 5 days is enough. Right, so there's no increase in self-rated overlap. Also, if we look at the like rating of the videos, there's no increase in rating in terms of like how painful did you think the video was, or how pleasurable did you think the video was. Similar for the ranking. So, yes?
Sorry, because you said some people actually enjoy it and others like have the opposite effect. So could it be that there's just individual differences? Some do see increase?
Right. That's a nice question. I will revisit that question at the end of the talk, because this is what we're doing with the log files now, yeah, to look at like an inter-individual approach, yeah.
How many participants?
So these were 28, yeah, yeah. So there's no increase in subjective rating or ranking of these painful or pleasurable videos. So going back to the brain, we look at the pain matrix. So we use a functional ROI interest. So we look at these 7 regions that are consistently implicated in empathy for pain. And so in the next slide, I will show you the difference score between the pre and post-socializing intervention. So then positive values indicate more overlap post-socializing, whereas negative scores indicate less overlap after the socializing intervention. And so we would expect to have more positive values after the 5 day, or yeah, observe more like positive scores as a result of this interaction. But however, we didn't find any differences whatsoever. So this is just for the bilateral insula, which is a key region in the pain matrix. So we don't find any main effect of agent, main effect of emotion or interaction. So there's nothing happening. So if we look at all the 7 brain regions, there's no increase or decrease. So there's nothing happening based on the brain data. Of course, this is the repetition suppression design. So the next step, what we did is we looked at the discrete coded events. So like human pain, human pleasure, robot pain, robot pleasure, and then we observed like a very small effect in the bilateral somatosensory secondary secondary somatosensory cortex. So there's less increase in activation for the robot post-socializing, but we're a bit hesitant to interpret it because it's a very small effect, and overall it's not replicated across these brain regions. So sadly, nothing is happening for the pain matrix, but if we look at the whole brain analyses, we see that, interestingly, humans compared to robots lead to more activation in early visual cortex, whereas the opposite contrast, robots versus human, results in this nice parietal activation. And I will show you that this is very consistent across studies we found recently. So I will interpret that in a moment. So the interesting fact is that there's no widespread activation that is, or humans don't, observing a human in pain doesn't result in more widespread activation than seeing a robot in pain, but the opposite contrast shows this widespread activation. Right, so concluding, we can distill that there's no difference in empathy towards the robot after 5 days socializing, both in behavior and in neural measures. So there's no more human-like response after this 5-day interaction. However, as already was asked, like what aspect of empathy did you look into? Like empathy is a very fuzzy concept. It's like sympathy, personal distress, perspective taking. So maybe we should focus on a well-defined aspect of social cognition, so something that's more easily measurable. So intention and emotion can be more easily measured, right? So you can be right in recognizing the emotion of someone or incorrect. And then in the last 5 minutes I will argue for a data-driven approach that will really help to understand if human social cognition is actually flexible at all when interacting with human-robot interaction, when interacting with robots. Right, so focusing on a well-defined aspect, so emotions. So in the next study we look at the attribution of emotions and intentions. So we can recognize these emotions very easily. The question is, do you recognize these emotions for Cosmo to the same extent? And of course, we look at the two regions that are key in understanding intentions and emotions, the person perception network and the theory of mind network. So we have the same setup as the previous study. So this time we had 33 participants. So again, first pre-socializing interaction session, and then the socializing intervention, and then the post-socializing intervention. So these were two separate samples. So participants didn't complete the two studies. Right, so then we have an intention task. So we would ask participants to indicate the intention of the human or the robot. So was it a helpful, not helpful, or a random intention? So basically your task is to locate the target, and the target is a red circle. It can either appear on the left or the right side of the agent, and so the agent can either be helping you in identifying the target or not, or it can be having a random intention. So it goes something like this. So the participant will see a series of faces, and then at the end the question will be, was this a helpful, not helpful, or random intention, right? And what we saw is that people are perfectly able to attribute intentions to robots. So the top graphs show the pre-socializing data. The bottom shows the post-socializing data. Human agents are in blue, and in orange is the robot agent. And so we don't see any difference between the two agents. So in terms of helpful, not helpful, or random intentions, it's the same. And there's also no difference in socializing sessions. So before the socializing, people don't see the robot as more random, and after they see it as more helpful. There's no difference between the two agents. And this is also replicated in a separate behavioral study, which we used more variability in the behavior of the robot and the human. And again, we showed that there's no difference between the human and robot. So, same for emotions. So we asked participants in the scanner to indicate the emotions of Cosmo or the human. So it could be either happy, angry, or sad. And you can, so the human data is now on top and the robot data is on the bottom, and then pre and post, left and right. And you can see that for human emotions, people are perfect and they recognize it really easily. And then for the robot data, they do really well as well. So around like 80% or higher. And then if we look at the wider range of emotions, so this is quite simple, right? So like 3 emotions, it's really easy, even like chance level. So if we look at like the 6 emotions, we see that for the human emotions, people are perfect, like scoring around like 100%. Whereas for the robot data, or for the robot emotions, you see that for sad, happy, and angry, they are perfect. But then for surprise, neutral, and fear, they're not really doing that well. But after the 5-day interaction, we see an increase in recognition rates for the surprised faces for the robot. So going from 38 to 64 increase, which is really nice. And the same for neutral faces, but not so much for fear. So there is some improvement in recognizing the emotions of this robot. And the same question we always ask in our studies, do you overlap with the robot and with your friends and with a stranger? And again, we don't see any differences there. So we see some differences in emotion recognition, so improvement there, but we don't see that there's more self-related overlap after a 5-day interaction with the Cosmo robot. Right, so let's get back to the brain. So similar to the previous study that showed like little activation for humans versus robots, we don't observe a lot of activations. So we see some more activation for human intentions and emotions in early visual cortex, but this is not the case like throughout the brain. However, if we look at the opposite contrast, robot versus human, we again see fusiform gyrus activation, IPL activation, nice parietal activation. So pre-socializing, post-socializing nicely overlaps. And this perfectly overlaps with an object localizer. So these are regions that are more active for objects compared to faces and bodies, right? So maybe a robot, like we're trying to humanize the robot, but maybe it's an object after all. So if we go back to the previous study, so the empathy study, we see that these activity patterns nicely overlap. If we go further back into the literature, so this is the object-specific brain regions by an independent localizer, so objects versus faces and bodies. We see that observing a robot in pain or experience pleasure, activation in object-specific regions, interacting with a robot, so real life, like online interactions with a robot, result in activation in these object-specific regions as well. Attributing attentions and emotions to this robot, same activations in these regions. And even observing a very simple robotic dance activates these regions. So maybe we should not only focus on the person perception network or the theory of mind network, but also consider that, well, maybe robots are activating more object-related regions even after a 5-day socializing intervention. Right, so I would argue that, okay, so we didn't find anything for empathy. There might be some room for improvement for emotion, but maybe we should also move away from a human-centered approach, that we're really trying to humanize this robot, and the ultimate goal of this robot is to be as human as possible. So maybe they're their distinct category, and that's perfectly fine. So that made me wonder, what's the relationship with anthropomorphism? So anthropomorphism is the tendency people have to attribute human-like characteristics to non-human agents. So is it related to the theory of mind network? So is is there like a linear relationship between how human you think the agent is and activity in this brain network. So for example, if you see a very robot, there will be less activity in this network. If it's like blurring between a human and a robot, it's maybe more, and it will be the highest activation for a human. So the question we're always trying to answer is to what extent do robots elicit the same responses as humans? Even so, in all our studies we do that as well. So is more activity more human-like, and is more activity related to increased anthropomorphism? So there is some indication that theory of mind network activation is linearly related to anthropomorphism. So more activity in the left TPJ, for example, as shown by Thierry Chaminade, is related to an anthropomorphic bias. So the tendency to attribute human-like characteristics to artificial agents. So there's some evidence that theory of mind network activation is related to anthropomorphism. So the question in this project, what we're trying to answer is, what is actually the relationship between people's tendencies to anthropomorphize non-human agents and activity within the theory of mind network? And so this is work done with Michaela, who's there. So if you have any questions about this project, you can ask her. So what we did is we collected a lot of functional localizers over the last 2 years, using a Partly Cloudy, which is a Pixar movie. So basically we pulled all that data together, and we have dispositional scores for anthropomorphism as well. So this theory of mind network is nicely correlated. Activity in this network is nicely correlated among the nodes. So the question is, what is the relationship between a tendency to anthropomorphize robots and activity in this brain region, or these brain regions? So if we would expect a linear relationship, this is not something we observe. So as you can see, the correlations are very close to 0. So linear correlations, using Pearson correlation, we don't observe a strong relation between a tendency to anthropomorphize and activity in the theory of mind network. What we observe is something like an inverted U-shape. So it's not necessary that if you have a higher tendency to anthropomorphize non-human agents, then there's more activity in the theory of mind network. No, it's highest when you have a medium tendency to anthropomorphize non-human agents. So this is really interesting because it tells us that, well, maybe it's the relationship between brain activity and anthropomorphism or attribution of emotions. It's much more complex than we thought, right? So it's an inverted U-shape. So it's not necessary that the more human, if you create a very human-like robot, it will induce a lot of anthropomorphism, and that's related to theory of mind network activation. Yeah.
Where's the cutoff? What happens at uncanny valley?
So that's a good question. So personally, I don't know. So for this data, I don't know. But my take on the uncanny valley is that it's a very tricky phenomenon that might be the result of experimental procedures, right? So it might be an artifact of the way we do studies, right? So if you see a passive, you see a picture of a robot, it might elicit this uncanny feelings. But if you interact with a robot, it might disappear after the first 5 seconds, right? When you can predict the future states of this robot, right? Something like that. So because the mind is very flexible, and you can adapt how you interpret movement, for example. Yeah, so in our studies, we're mostly not concerned with the uncanny valley. So we observed this across the 6 brain regions of the theory of mind network. And so now we're collecting some more data to have a formal replication or testing of this relationship. So yeah, so the relationship between anthropomorphizing and theory of mind network activation might not be linear, it might be more complex than we thought. Right, so in the last 5 minutes, I I would just want to highlight some new approaches we're taking. So new ways of analyzing, well, it's not really new, but like a new way of approaching fMRI data during human-robot interaction, and also focusing on the data-driven and inter-individual differences in these human-robot interactions. Right, so there's multiple ways, as you know, to analyze data, or like fMRI data. So we can do univariate analysis, and then this is only speaking to how we perceive and interact with robots. So we can look at the magnitude of activation. So humans elicit more activation in the fusiform phase area, for example, compared to robots. But it doesn't really tell us something about the representation of robotic emotions, right? Then what we did is you can use repetition suppression, so showing that like human followed by a robot in pain does or does not decrease activity in brain regions that are associated with experience or like observing pain. But so the next step, what we're doing right now, is actually using RSA to look at the similarity between the brain responses to, for example, a robot in pain and a human in pain. And so we can actually use stimulus descriptions. For example, would we expect that activity in the FFA is more related to a description that speaks to an agent? So then all the activity to a robot would be correlated, but not correlated with human responses? Or would we expect more emotion descriptions? So then like an angry robot would be correlated with an angry human as well. So this allows us to tease apart what's actually represented in the brain region. And something that I'm doing right now, and hopefully will be finished really soon, so we can release the preprint, is looking at shared representation. So basically what we're doing is using multivoxel pattern analysis by training and classify to distinguish, in this case, a happy robot from an angry robot, and then using this classifier and testing it on to distinguishing a human that experiences anger and a happy human. So can we actually use the classifier that's trained on the robot data on the human data? If so, that would mean that there's shared representation, right? Because then the classifier should be able to tell apart emotions regardless of the agent. And I think this is the way forward to really get to a deeper level and understanding of how we actually make sense of a world filled with robots. Right. So basically this is, in more detail, training a linear support vector machine, telling apart like emotional robots, and then testing out emotional humans. But the other approach we're taking is looking in detail what people actually do during this 5-day interaction. And as you saw, there's a lot of variation in the total duration between participants. And so something that I was looking into is that like Facebook, for example, has this algorithm to make sure that like you engage enough with Facebook and then you can manipulate that. So for example, this is what Kramer did in 2014, in that they showed you positive or negative emotions, but they also showed that if you don't show people enough variability in the emotional content of the post, people actually are less emotional after that on Facebook, right? So we can use this to understand how people actually interact with a robot. And I will explain that in a moment, because we have the data from the 5-day interaction. So we know exactly what people did. So we know that like on day 3, like the face was recognized, they played like a speed tap, participant won, played a memory match game, the participant won. For another session we know that as well. So we can use this information actually to distill patterns that would predict the duration of the human-robot interaction. So what we've done is that we've mapped the entire behavior of Cosmo on a 2-dimensional grid. So valence, so positive or negative emotions, and then arousal, so relaxed or very like engaging And so we map the entire behavioral repertoire of this robot, and then we can use that to see, well, this participant only interacted for like 60 minutes. Well, maybe this is because he only saw like negative emotions or something like that. So this is the entire behavioral repertoire of Cosmo. As you can see, overall, it's like very neutral, with some positive, some negative emotions there as well. And so these are all the categories that the developer programmed in Cosmo, or all the social categories. And so actually we now have like a data-driven approach, and we can have an informed decision on, is this actually, this behavior, is this really positive or negative? For example, if we zoom in, like celebrate, so the reaction celebrate is a very positive, high arousing emotion. Whereas a reaction to face is considered neutral by most of the participants. This really allows us to tease apart what behaviors people were exposed to. So we can use this. So this is a Shiny app that is online now. So this is the beta version. So it's like nothing near done. But this would allow you, if you have a Cosmo robot, to really like select all the behavioral categories, and then you can inform that for future research. And you can select it, so you actually know what kind of behaviors Cosmo is showing to your participants. Right, so we can use this to look at the patterns of emotions that people were exposed to during the 5-day interaction, right? So we have a participant that interacted for more than 200 minutes, only 55 minutes, 172, and 62 minutes. So we can actually look into what participants were exposed to, and then maybe distill some factors that influence duration. So I don't have a definite answer because this is ongoing work, but I just want to highlight what we're working on right now, because I think this is really the way forward, because now we have a lot of information, what people actually did, what emotions they were exposed to, and then we can use this, like similar to like Facebook, Instagram, and YouTube have these algorithms to like maximize engagement. We can actually look at what maximizes engagement with a small robot. Right, so concluding, there's not really like flexibility of empathy for robots, maybe for emotions, but maybe we should move away from only looking at like these theories, mind network activations and person perception network activation, and use like new approaches to fMRI data, use a data-driven approach that allows for individual differences. So I'm not sure if I answered your question just now, kinda. But I think this is a really nice way forward to understand how people interact with robots, how they perceive them. And also, one could say that we're in a social robotics winter with all these companies failing. So I would argue that by understanding how people make sense of this social world filled with technology, by looking at their brain, that can really help to advance the development of social agents. So that's it. So if you want to read more, there's a special issue in Phil Trends that was published this year. And thank you.